The B-2 bombers are incredible. It went into Iran and it totally decimated the nuclear potential. And when it decimated that, all of a sudden we had peace in the Middle East because there was a black cloud hanging over the Middle East. And you couldn't have peace in the Middle East. So now we may have to take it a step further, or we may not. Maybe we're going to make a deal. You're going to be finding out over the next probably 10 days.
Is the U.S. on the verge of attacking Iran? The world is watching as President Trump builds a massive military presence in the Middle East, which includes 2 aircraft carriers, air defense systems, and dozens of land-based planes. Here with more is the Hill's White House columnist Niall Stanage. Niall, the U.S. held indirect talks with Iranian officials in Geneva this week about Tehran's nuclear program. And today, while hosting a Board of Peace meeting here in D.C., President Trump had this to say.
You know, Iran is a hot spot right now, and they're meeting, and they have a good relationship with the representatives of Iran, and, you know, good talks are being had. It's proven to be, over the years, not easy to make a meaningful deal with Iran. We have to make a meaningful deal, otherwise bad things happen.
What do you make of these comments, Niall?
Well, I think, as is often the case with President Trump, the specific meaning simply isn't really clear. We don't know precisely what kind of deal he is seeking. There has been reporting that it might involve, for example, Iran giving up all of its ballistic missile capabilities, quite separate from the nuclear question. Most experts think the Iranian regime would not do that. But then, as you noted in your introduction, Judy, there's also this question of the United States flexing its military muscle as a de facto threat to Iran if the Iranians do not make a deal that is to Trump's liking, whatever that would entail.
Now, as I'm sure you know, President Trump has sent the largest concentration of air power to the Middle East since 2003, which would give the U.S. the option of carrying out a weeks-long air war against Iran. Well, President Trump hasn't decided whether to order strikes. If an operation like that were to happen, what would be the repercussions in the region, and would U.S. military personnel eventually be forced to be on the ground in Iran?
Well, it would be a massive, massive escalation and a very unpredictable situation in many ways. I mean, Iran is a major power in the Middle East. Obviously, it has built up its military over many, many years. I'm old enough to remember the Iran-Iraq War, which was an enormously bloody conflict during my childhood. So if the United States were to go in, of course, America has greater military power than Iran does. But what are the ultimate effects? And what would be the aim of the operation? Would it simply be to topple the regime? Well, if that's the aim, what replaces the regime? We have seen elsewhere in the Middle East at times leaders toppled, but enormous bloodshed and chaos following on from that toppling. So I think that's part of the danger here for the U.S.
Now, this week, Iran held live fire drills in the Strait of Hormuz, shutting down the water corridor where 20% of the world's oil passes. And Iran's supreme leader threatened to sink U.S. vessels amid nuclear talks this week. Is this where Iran would focus its military power if the U.S. were to strike?
Quite possibly. I mean, in a direct, fully frontal war, the United States could defeat Iran. But that doesn't mean that the Iranians are incapable of inflicting real pain, not just on the US, but on international trade, affecting the oil supply, affecting, key waterways and all of that. So, in a conflict, your opponent has the chance to make their own moves. And the Iranians would certainly seek, I think, to fight a somewhat asymmetrical conflict in which they used all the strategic cunning that they could have to make life as difficult as possible, not only for the United States, but for the West in general.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio will travel to Israel next week to update Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the U.S.-Iran talks. How involved would Israel be in a potential attack on Iran?
Hard to say exactly militarily, but certainly Netanyahu has regarded Iran as a key foe for years and years, decades, and obviously is someone who favors US intervention in Iran, the US trying to hollow out Iran, because Netanyahu sees the Iranians as a kind of a keystone that holds together various forces that he dislikes because he considers them anti-Israel. So that whole element in things is important. Of course, Mr. Netanyahu, an enormously controversial figure, faces war crimes charges at the International Criminal Court himself. All of that is part of this picture too.
Now, I want to ask you, President Trump ran for office on the promise of keeping the U.S. out of international wars, but after his Venezuela operation and the MAGA base largely supporting that decision, does he feel emboldened enough that he can more or less flex the military power of the U.S. without losing support?
He may do, but whether he's right or not is another matter. You're quite right to say that the MAGA base was, at least at one point, fueled by a kind of isolationism. This America First idea, the idea that the long conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan had cost the United States in both lives and in money, and that therefore the US should at least pull back from international commitments. Now, if Trump were to go ahead with a full-on attack on Iran, a war in Iran, I do think it would be, at the very least, open to question how the MAGA base would react. And of course, in the wider world, among both American liberals and people internationally, I think there would be, frankly, a lot of opposition to such an effort.
Niall Standish, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Judy.